In the final hours of a war already lost, one radio operator made a choice that would echo through history, not with the roar of victory, but with the whisper of humanity in hell. This is not a story about tactical brilliance or miraculous last stands. This is a story about what happens when the machinery of war collides with the fragility of the human soul, when protocol meets conscience, and when a young man holding a microphone becomes the last witness to voices that will never speak again. It is a story that was buried, classified, hidden away in the dusty archives of military history, not because it revealed strategic secrets, but because it revealed something far more dangerous, the unfiltered truth of what we ask our sons to endure when we send them to war. Stephen E. Ambrose, the great chronicler of American soldiers, once wrote that the real heroes are the men who fight when they know they are beaten. He understood something profound about the nature of courage, that it is not found in the certainty of victory, but in the willingness to stand when hope has abandoned the field. The transmission you are about to hear was made by such men, men who knew the cavalry was not coming, men who understood that their coordinates on a map had been circled, assessed, and written off as acceptable losses in the larger calculus of war. Men who fought not because they believed they would survive, but because they refused to die as anything less than human. And at the center of this circle of the doomed stood one young radio operator, a technical specialist who had joined the military for college money and found himself transformed into something ancient and sacred, a keeper of last words, a witness to the final confessions of dying men, the umbilical cord between souls departing this world and the homes they would never see again. The radio in combat is more than equipment. It is the proof of connection, the mechanical heartbeat that says you are not alone in the chaos. Every radio check, every crackle of static resolved into a human voice, is a small act of faith that someone, somewhere, still knows you exist. That your life still matters to the machinery that sent you here. That if you fall, someone will know where and when and how. The radio operator becomes, in those moments, the most important man in the unit. Not the strongest, not the bravest, but the one who holds the thread connecting you to everything you left behind. And when that thread is about to be cut forever, when the voices on the other end offer nothing but hollow reassurances and bureaucratic protocol, what does a man do with that microphone? What does he choose to transmit when he knows that headquarters has already moved on? That the mission is over, that these men beside him have been reduced to statistics in a report that no one will read with tears in their eyes. Tim O'Brien, who carried the weight of Vietnam in his bones and his prose, once wrote something that every person who speaks about war should remember. A true war story is never moral. It does not instruct, nor encourage virtue, nor suggest models of proper human behavior, nor restrain men from doing the things men have always done. If a story seems moral, do not believe it. What you are about to hear is not a moral story. It will not comfort you with easy lessons or patriotic certainties. It will not tell you that everything happened for a reason, or that these deaths purchased something clean and noble. It is simply true. It is what happened when one young man, surrounded by the dying, decided that the rules governing military communications were less important than the rules governing human decency. It is what happened when protocol became obscenity, when following orders meant betraying the trust of men who had minutes left to live. It is uncomfortable. It is raw. It does not fit neatly into the narratives we prefer about war, the ones where sacrifice is always meaningful, where death is always dignified, where the fallen are remembered as heroes and not as terrified young men crying for their mothers in languages stripped of all pretense. The question that haunts this story, the question that should haunt anyone who hears it, is this: what do you transmit when you know no one is coming to save you? When your last words will not be carved in marble, or read at memorial services, but archived in a classified file, stamped with security clearances, hidden from the very families who have the right to hear them. When the microphone in your hand is the only thing standing between these men and absolute erasure, not from death, which was coming regardless, but from memory, from meaning, from mattering at all. What do you say? Do you follow the manual, maintain communication discipline, report grid coordinates and enemy positions as if any of it still matters? Or do you break every rule you were taught and use those final minutes to build a monument out of sound, to speak their names into the record, to make sure that somewhere, somehow, someone knows they were here? They were afraid, they were human, they were loved, and they died asking for things as simple and profound as pot roast and the names of babies they would never hold. This is a story about the weight of the microphone. Not its physical weight, a few pounds of metal and circuitry, but the terrible spiritual weight of being the last voice, the final witness, the keeper of words that will outlive the men who spoke them. It is about a young soldier who understood, in those final hours, that he was not a radio operator anymore. He had become something else entirely. A priest hearing confessions, a scribe recording an oral history that no one authorized, a guardian of souls slipping away from this world, who needed, in their last moments, not tactical support or air cover, but simply to be remembered as something more than a casualty count. This is not a story about tactical genius or miraculous survival. This is a story about the terrible intimacy of bearing witness to the end, and the choice one man made when the machinery of war demanded silence, and the humanity of dying men demanded their names be spoken aloud, one last time, into the indifferent static of a world that had already moved on. There is a ritual in war that most people never think about, a small ceremony repeated thousands of times across every battlefield in history. It happens in foxholes and bunkers, in the bellies of aircraft and the cramped quarters of armored vehicles. It is the radio check. A voice crackles through static, calls out a designation and waits for the response that confirms connection, that proves you are not alone in the vast machinery of combat. Charlie 6, this is Echo 2, radio check. Over. And then, after a breath that feels longer than it should, the response, Echo 2, this is Charlie 6, I read you Lima Charlie. Over. Loud and clear. Those 3 words are more than a technical confirmation of signal strength. They are proof of existence. They are the thread that connects you to the world, beyond the immediate terror, the bureaucratic proof that someone, somewhere, still knows you are alive and considers your survival worth monitoring. The radio operator becomes, in those moments, the keeper of that thread, the man who maintains the connection between the chaos of the front line and the clean, ordered world of command posts and strategic planning. He is the voice that says, you have not been forgotten, that your grid coordinates still matter, that if you fall, someone will know exactly where to find your body. Our operator was 22 years old, a specialist 4th class who had scored high on the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery in the electronics section. He was the kind of young man who had always been good with his hands, who could take apart a radio and reassemble it blindfolded, who understood the language of frequencies and encryption keys better than he understood the language of small talk or emotional intimacy. He had joined for practical reasons, the steady paycheck, the GI Bill that would get him through college, the technical training that would translate into a civilian career. He had not joined to become a warrior or a hero. He had certainly not joined to become a witness to the last words of dying men, to hold in his memory the final thoughts of soldiers who would never make it home. But war has a way of transforming us into things we never intended to become, of taking the careful plans we made in recruiting offices and burning them away, until all that remains is the raw core of who we are when everything else has been stripped away. He carried 60 pounds of radio equipment on his back, but the real weight was invisible, the weight of being the lifeline, the voice. The connection between men who were bleeding out in the mud and families who were setting dinner tables thousands of miles away, still believing their sons were safe. The situation had been deteriorating for days. What had started as a routine patrol into contested territory had turned into something else entirely: a trap, an ambush, a tactical disaster that unfolded with the slow inevitability of a nightmare you cannot wake from. They were surrounded, cut off from the main force. The supply drops never came. The air support was diverted to another sector, another crisis, another set of coordinates deemed more strategically valuable. But the radio still worked. That was the strange mercy and the terrible curse of their situation. The equipment functioned perfectly. The batteries held their charge. The signal reached headquarters with crystal clarity, and headquarters responded with the clean, procedural language of military communications, acknowledging their position, confirming their status, promising support that never materialized. The disconnect between what was being said over the radio and what was happening on the ground grew wider with each transmission. Command spoke in acronyms and grid references, in estimated times of arrival for reinforcements that were always 6 hours away, then 12 hours, then sometime tomorrow. They spoke as if this was still a tactical situation that could be managed with proper resource allocation and strategic repositioning. They did not speak as if they were talking to men who could hear their own death, approaching with every passing hour. The operator listened to both sides of this conversation, the increasingly desperate requests for support from his captain, and the increasingly hollow reassurances from headquarters, and understood what was not being said. He had been trained to read signal strength and frequency clarity, but he had learned something else entirely in these final days: how to read the tone of voices, the pauses between words, the things that were communicated in what was carefully not mentioned. When headquarters stopped asking for casualty reports, he knew they had written this unit off as a total loss. When they stopped promising specific times for relief columns, he knew no one was coming. When they started using phrases like "hold your position as long as tactically feasible" and "maintain communication for intelligence purposes," he understood that his unit had been reclassified from soldiers to be saved into sources of information to be extracted before they were overrun. The radio that had once been his connection to safety, to civilization, to the promise that someone valued his life enough to bring him home, had become something else entirely. It had become a microphone broadcasting into a void, a one-way transmission to people who were listening only to gather tactical intelligence, not to mount a rescue that would risk additional lives for men who were already as good as dead. He sat in what remained of their defensive position, the radio handset pressed against his ear, and listened to the voice of a staff sergeant 60 miles away explaining why the relief column could not move until morning, why the air assets were committed elsewhere, why they needed to conserve ammunition and prepare for a fighting withdrawal to a more defensible position. The words were professional, calm, measured. The voice showed no emotion, gave no indication that it understood what those words meant to men who had been fighting for 3 days straight, who were down to their last magazines, who had wounded soldiers crying in the darkness because they had run out of morphine. The operator looked around at his unit, at boys who had become men too quickly, at men who had aged decades in days, and felt something break inside him. Not his courage, not his discipline, something deeper than that. The machinery of war requires certain fictions to function. It requires soldiers to believe that their lives matter to the system, that following orders serves a purpose, that communication with headquarters means someone is working to bring them home. And in that moment, listening to headquarters respond with protocol while his brothers died around him, the operator realized that the fiction had collapsed. They were not part of a military operation anymore. They were men who had been sacrificed to necessity, whose deaths would be explained in after-action reports as acceptable losses in the context of larger strategic objectives. They were broadcasting into a void that responded with the scripted language of bureaucracy, and no one on the other end was treating them like human beings who deserved more than radio discipline in their final hours. They had not started as brothers. They had started as strangers, thrown together by the arbitrary machinery of military assignment. Men from different states, different backgrounds, different lives, who had nothing in common, except the uniform and the misfortune of being assigned to the same unit. There was Jenkins from rural Alabama, who talked too much about fishing and had a laugh that sounded like gravel in a bucket. There was Rodriguez from the Bronx, who could curse in 3 languages and made coffee so strong it could strip paint. There was Miller, the college kid who had dropped out in his sophomore year and still carried a paperback copy of Hemingway in his rucksack, the pages swollen with humidity and blood. There was Washington, the quiet one, who wrote letters home every night and never let anyone read them, who had a daughter he had met only in photographs. There was the captain, a career officer who had been 3 weeks from rotation when this mission came down, who had a wife waiting and a teaching position lined up at a military academy, who had already started planning his exit from the war. They were not brothers in any natural sense. They were simply men who happened to occupy the same space at the same time, following the same orders, moving through the same hostile territory toward the same uncertain objective. But something happens when you share foxholes and fear, when you eat together and sleep in shifts watching each other's backs, when you see each other at your worst and your weakest and your most terrified. The artificial bonds created by military structure transform into something deeper, something that cannot be explained to people who have never lived it. They became a family in the way that only soldiers can, not through blood or choice, but through shared suffering and mutual dependence, through the absolute knowledge that your survival depends on the man next to you, and his survival depends on you. They learned each other's rhythms and habits, the small rituals that made life bearable in unbearable circumstances. Jenkins always hummed the same gospel hymn when he was nervous. Rodriguez always touched the rosary his grandmother had given him before every patrol. Miller always quoted some line from a book nobody else had read, as if literature could somehow make sense of the senselessness. Washington always checked his weapon exactly 7 times before leaving the wire, counting silently, his lips moving around numbers that had become prayer. The captain always gathered them before missions and said the same thing. We go out together, we come back together. Nobody gets left behind. They shared cigarettes, even though half of them did not smoke, passing them around like communion wafers because the act of sharing mattered more than the nicotine. They told the same stupid jokes over and over until the punchlines became meaningless, and the laughter became a reflex, a way of saying, we are still here, we are still human. We have not been completely consumed by this thing yet. They passed around photographs of girlfriends and wives and children, handled with more care than they handled their weapons. Images of faces they were fighting to return to, reminders of who they had been before the war, tried to remake them into something else. Rodriguez carried a picture of his mother in her kitchen, spatula in hand, smiling at whoever was behind the camera. Jenkins had a photograph of his high school sweetheart, standing beside a lake at sunset, the light turning everything golden. Miller had a picture of his younger sister at her college graduation. The family he had disappointed by dropping out gathered around her in pride. Washington had that photograph of his daughter, 9 months old, a child he had never held, whose first steps he had missed, whose first words had been reported to him in letters that took weeks to arrive, and were read until the paper began to disintegrate at the creases. The radio had been just equipment, just another piece of gear that served a tactical function. But in these final days, as the situation deteriorated and hope drained away, like blood from a wound no one could stop, the radio became something else entirely. It became a confessional. Men who had never spoken about fear, who had maintained the careful masculine silence that military culture demands, began to approach the operator in the darkness and ask if they could say something just in case. They did not frame it as last words. They did not acknowledge what they all knew was coming. They simply asked if he could make sure someone knows if something happens. Could you tell them? Could you make sure they understand? Could you let them know that in the end, when everything else fell away, this is what I was thinking about? The operator listened because that was all he could do. He listened to Jenkins talk about the pond behind his grandmother's house, where he used to fish as a boy, where the water was so still you could see straight down to the mud, and the fish moved like shadows beneath the surface. He listened to Rodriguez describe his mother's kitchen, the smell of sofrito, and the sound of salsa music on the radio, the way she hummed along even when she did not know the words. He listened to Miller talk about books he wished he had finished, conversations he wished he had started. The girl from his English literature class, whose name he could not remember, but whose smile he had never forgotten. The confessions were not dramatic or profound. They were heartbreakingly ordinary. Jenkins said, "Tell my mom I was thinking about her pot roast," and laughed as if it were a joke, but his eyes were wet and his hands were shaking. Rodriguez said, "Tell my abuela her rosary worked. I made it this far, didn't I?" and touched the beads around his neck like they were made of something more precious than wood and wire. Miller said, "Tell my sister I'm sorry I never made it to her wedding. Tell her I was proud of her, even if I was too stupid to say it," and turned away before the operator could see his face. Washington said, "Tell my daughter her daddy loved her. Tell her I carried her picture right here over my heart. Tell her that when it got bad I looked at her face, and it made everything okay for just a minute." And his voice broke on the last word. And he did not try to hide it anymore because there was no point in hiding anything when you had hours left instead of years. The operator took mental notes, tried to memorize every word, every inflection, every small detail that might matter to someone waiting at home. He had not been trained for this. The manual covered radio procedure and equipment maintenance and proper communication protocol. It did not cover what to do when your radio becomes a repository for last words. When maintaining communication discipline means ignoring the most important transmissions of all, the ones that do not involve tactics or coordinates or intelligence updates, but simply the final thoughts of men who need someone to remember. They were more than statistics, more than names on a casualty list, more than acceptable losses in the calculus of war. The captain found him on the third night, when the ammunition was nearly gone, and everyone knew that morning would bring the end. The captain sat down beside him without speaking, looked at the radio equipment like it was a gravestone, and then said something that the operator would carry for the rest of his life. "Keep transmitting our position," the captain said, his voice steady despite everything. "Maybe it'll matter to someone someday. Not to us," he did not say. "Not in time to save us. But maybe in some distant future, some historian or researcher or archivist will want to know exactly where and when we died. Maybe someone will care enough to mark the spot, to add our names to a database, to include us in the record of this war. Maybe our deaths will be studied by cadets learning tactics, analyzed by strategists planning future campaigns, referenced in books that reduce us to footnotes and lessons learned." The captain was not naive. He knew they were beyond saving, but he still believed that their deaths should mean something, that someone should know the exact grid coordinates where they made their stand, that the war should at least have the decency to remember where it disposed of them. And the operator nodded, adjusted his equipment, and prepared to do exactly that, to keep broadcasting their position until the signal went dead, to be the voice that said, "We were here. We fought, we did not run, we died where we stood." It was the last order the captain would ever give, and it was also, in its way, an act of faith, faith that somewhere, in some record, in some memory, they would not be completely erased by the machinery of war that had consumed them. There comes a moment in every soldier's life when he must choose between the orders he has been given and the conscience that refuses to be silenced. It is the moment when the carefully constructed machinery of military discipline, with all its regulations and protocols and chains of command, collides with something older and more fundamental, the basic human recognition that some things matter more than procedure, that some duties transcend the ones written in field manuals. The operator had followed every rule since the day he enlisted. He had memorized the communication protocols, practiced the encryption procedures, learned the precise language required for tactical transmissions. He had been taught that radio discipline was not merely a technical requirement, but a sacred trust, that unauthorized transmissions could compromise operations, reveal positions, endanger lives. He had internalized the doctrine that personal communication was forbidden on military channels, that the radio existed to serve the mission and nothing else, that his feelings and the feelings of the men around him were irrelevant compared to the operational necessity of maintaining clear and secure lines of communication. He had been a good soldier. He had followed the manual. He had done everything exactly as he was trained. And now, in the final hours, surrounded by dying men whose last words were being spoken into the indifferent darkness, he understood that following the manual had become a moral obscenity, that maintaining radio discipline meant betraying every human obligation he possessed. The moment of rebellion did not announce itself with drama or fanfare. It came quietly, in the space between one transmission and the next. In the pause after headquarters had responded to his situation report with another request for grid coordinates and enemy strength estimates, as if any of that tactical information would change anything for the men bleeding out around him. He looked at the microphone in his hand. He looked at Jenkins, who was sitting with his back against a shattered wall, holding his stomach where the field dressing had already soaked through with blood. He looked at Rodriguez, who was whispering prayers in Spanish, his grandmother's rosary wrapped around his hand so tightly the beads had left impressions in his palm. He looked at Miller, who had finally stopped trying to read his Hemingway and was just staring at nothing, his face gray with shock and blood loss. He looked at Washington, who was still clutching that photograph of his daughter, his thumb rubbing across her face like he could somehow touch her across the distance and the time and the unbridgeable gap between the living and the dying. And he made a decision that would result in a court-martial, that would violate every regulation governing military communications, that would end his career and possibly his freedom. He decided that these men deserved more than coordinates on a map. They deserved to be remembered as human beings. They deserved to have their names spoken aloud. They deserved to have someone bear witness to who they were, what they loved, what they lost, and what they were thinking about in their final moments. He keyed the microphone and began to transmit, but not the tactical report headquarters was expecting. Instead of enemy positions and ammunition status, he began to speak names. This is Specialist 4th Class Michael Chen, radio operator for what remains of Echo Company. I am transmitting for the record, for anyone who might listen someday, for the families who deserve to know. His voice was steady, almost ceremonial, like a priest beginning a ritual older than war itself. Private First Class Robert Jenkins from Gadsden, Alabama, 20 years old, son of Martha and Robert Jenkins Sr. He wanted you to know he was thinking about fishing at his grandmother's pond. He wanted you to know he remembered her pot roast and Sunday dinners and the way the light came through the kitchen window in the morning. He wanted you to know he was not afraid at the end, or if he was, he did not show it. He wanted you to know he did his duty. He wanted you to know he loved you. The radio crackled with silence, and then headquarters cut in, confused and angry. Echo 2, this is Charlie 6. Maintain proper radio discipline. Repeat your last transmission in proper format, over. The operator ignored them. He continued. Specialist Marcus Rodriguez from the Bronx, New York, 22 years old. His grandmother gave him a rosary, and he carried it every day. He wanted her to know it worked. He wanted his mother to know he remembered her kitchen, the music she played, the way she hummed even when she did not know the words. He wanted his family to know he kept his faith. He wanted them to know he died praying. Headquarters was shouting now, demanding compliance, ordering him to cease unauthorized transmissions immediately. threatening disciplinary action, invoking regulations and codes and the uniform code of military justice. The operator reached down and adjusted the squelch, reducing their angry voices to background static, a distant buzz that had no power over him anymore. He kept transmitting. Private First Class James Miller from Portland, Oregon. 21 years old. He read Hemingway and carried books even when they weighed him down. He wanted his sister to know he was proud of her, that he was sorry he missed her wedding, that he thought about her every day. He wanted his parents to know he was sorry he dropped out of college, that he knew he disappointed them, but he had tried to make it right by serving honorably. He wanted the girl from his literature class, the one whose name he could not remember, but whose smile he never forgot, to know that thinking about that smile got him through hard days. He wanted everyone to know he never finished building that deck behind his parents' house, and he hoped someone would finish it for him. The words were flowing now, unstoppable. A verbal monument being constructed in real time over encrypted military channels. He was building something that had no official sanction, no place in the military record, no authorization from anyone in his chain of command. He was using government equipment to broadcast the poetry of dying men, the fragments of interrupted lives, the small and ordinary thoughts that meant more than any tactical intelligence ever could. Corporal Terrence Washington, from Detroit, Michigan, 23 years old, father of a 9-month-old daughter named Grace. He never held her. He never heard her first words or saw her first steps. He carried her photograph over his heart and looked at it whenever things got bad. He wanted his daughter to know that her daddy loved her more than anything in this world, that thinking about her face made everything bearable, that she was the reason he kept fighting, the reason he did not give up, the reason he tried to be brave even when he was terrified. He wanted his wife to know he was sorry he left before the baby was born, that he understood if she was angry, that he hoped Grace would remember him somehow even though she was too young to form memories. He wanted his daughter to know that when it got very bad, at the very end, he looked at her picture and whispered her name and felt peace. The transmission continued. Each name a small act of defiance against the machinery that reduced human beings to casualty statistics. He spoke their hometowns like sacred geography, Gadsden and the Bronx and Portland and Detroit, places that had sent their sons to war and would receive them back in flag-draped coffins, places that deserved to know these men had not died as numbers, but as individuals with names and stories and people who loved them. He spoke their ages like accusations, 20, 21, 22, 23. Boys who should have been finishing college or starting careers or getting married or becoming fathers. Boys who would never age beyond this moment, who would remain forever young in the memories of people who would grow old without them. Headquarters had stopped shouting. Now they were threatening. Court-martial for insubordination. Charges for unauthorized use of military communications equipment. Violation of operational security. Failure to maintain communication discipline. Possible treason for broadcasting classified information on open channels. The threats scrolled past like credits at the end of a movie he was no longer watching. None of it mattered anymore. They could court-martial him if he survived. They could imprison him. They could dishonorably discharge him and take away his benefits and mark him for the rest of his life as someone who had violated the sacred trust of military service. It was all meaningless compared to the duty he was performing now, the obligation that superseded every order he had ever received. Jenkins had trusted him to remember the pot roast. Rodriguez had trusted him to tell his grandmother the rosary worked. Miller had trusted him to apologize to his sister. Washington had trusted him to tell his daughter she was loved. They had given him their last words, their final thoughts, the things that mattered most when everything else had been burned away by combat. And he would be damned, actually literally damned, before he let those words die unspoken. Before he let the military file these men away as KIA with no explanation, no context, no humanity. Nothing but a date and a grid reference, and a cause of death reduced to cold clinical language. The raw poetry of dying men continued to flow through his microphone. Tell Sarah the baby's name should be Claire, not Catherine like her mother wanted. Tell her I'm sorry I won't be there, but I know she'll be an amazing mother. Tell her to find someone good, someone who treats her right, someone who makes her laugh. Tell her I wanted to marry her and I'm sorry I waited too long to say it. Whose words were those? The operator did not even remember anymore. They were all bleeding together now. All the confessions and apologies and last-minute declarations of love. All the unfinished sentences of lives cut short. I never finished building that deck. The boards are in the garage. The plans are in the blue folder on my workbench. Someone should finish it. My dad always wanted a deck. It would make him happy. Fragments of interrupted lives broadcast into the void, preserved in a recording that no family would ever hear, but that would exist somewhere. In some archive, proof that these men had been more than coordinates on a map. More than acceptable losses, more than the price of strategic objectives. Tell my brother I'm sorry about the money I borrowed. It's in my footlocker, everything I owe him plus interest. Tell him he was right about me joining up. Tell him I should have listened. Apologies that would never be delivered. Debts that would never be paid. Conversations that would never happen. All of it transmitted into static, preserved in the strange amber of military recordings, filed away and classified and forgotten. The technical violation had become a sacred act. He was misusing military equipment, yes. He was violating communication protocol, absolutely. He was ignoring direct orders from headquarters, without question. But he was also doing something that the manual had no language for. He was bearing witness. He was honoring the dead before they were even dead. He was building a monument out of sound and memory and the last desperate words of men who needed someone to remember that they had lived, that they had mattered, that they had loved and been loved in return. This was not tactical information. This was not intelligence that would help win the war. This was something older and more important. It was the human record, the oral history of men at the moment of their deaths, the preservation of voices that would soon be silenced forever. And if preserving that record meant violating every regulation in the manual, if it meant ending his career and facing punishment and being marked as someone who could not follow orders, then so be it. Some violations of protocol are acts of higher obedience. Some failures to follow orders are demonstrations of a deeper discipline, one that serves conscience instead of command, one that honors the human obligation that supersedes all military duty. He had been taught that his job was to maintain communications, and that is exactly what he was doing, maintaining the most important communication of all, the one between the dying and those who would survive to remember them. The eternal transmission that says you were here, you mattered, you were loved, and your last words will not die with you in this forgotten corner of a war that has already moved on to other coordinates, other casualties, other acceptable losses in the endless arithmetic of combat. The transmission did not end with a dramatic final word or a heroic declaration. It did not end with the operator's voice rising in defiant crescendo, shouting truths into the void until enemy fire silenced him forever. It ended the way most things end in war, not with meaning or poetry or the clean narrative closure that stories require, but with simple exhaustion, with the biological fact that a human body can only endure so much before it stops functioning, with the quiet cessation of breath and thought and the ability to form words. The operator had been speaking for 47 minutes, his voice growing hoarse, his throat raw from the effort of transforming dying men's whispers into transmissions that would outlive them. He had spoken 23 names. He had relayed final messages that ranged from profound to heartbreakingly mundane. He had built a verbal monument to men who would have no other memorial except whatever their families chose to place in small-town cemeteries thousands of miles from where they actually fell. And then, in the middle of a sentence, he was saying something about how Private Chen wanted his younger brother to have his baseball card collection, how he had been saving it since childhood, how it was supposed to pay for college someday. His voice simply stopped. Not because he had finished, not because he had said everything that needed saying, but because the body that housed that voice had reached its limit, had absorbed too much damage, had burned through too much adrenaline and will, and the stubborn human refusal to surrender until the task is complete. The radio remained keyed. The carrier wave continued, that steady electronic hum that indicates an open channel, a microphone still transmitting even though no one is speaking into it anymore. On the other end, at headquarters 60 miles away, staff officers and communication specialists sat listening to that empty static, that audio void, where a voice had been moments before, unsure what to do with it. Military protocol had procedures for everything, for lost contact, for communications failure, for units going dark. But there was no procedure for this, for a channel that remained open, but silent, for a microphone that was still broadcasting the absence of the man who had been holding it. They listened to the carrier wave for minutes that stretched into hours, hearing in that electronic hum the ghost of transmissions, the echo of names that had been spoken in violation of every regulation they were sworn to uphold. Some wanted to terminate the connection immediately, to close the channel and file a report and move on to other tactical concerns. Others insisted they should maintain the link, that as long as the signal continued, someone might still be alive, that switching off the receiver would be a final abandonment of men who might yet be saved. So they compromised with bureaucratic indecision and left the channel open, monitoring that empty carrier wave like it was a vigil, like their listening could somehow matter to men who were beyond hearing, beyond help, beyond everything except the final transition from life to whatever comes after. The silence continued for 3 hours and 42 minutes. In that silence you could hear nothing and everything. You could hear the absence of voices that would never speak again. You could hear the weight of words that had been transmitted and could never be taken back. Names that had been spoken into the permanent record. Confessions that had been preserved in a medium that would outlast memory and monuments, and perhaps even the nations that had sent these men to die. The staff officers at headquarters sat with headphones pressed to their ears, listening to static, and some of them wept without understanding exactly why, without being able to articulate what it was about, that empty carrier wave that broke something inside them. They had heard casualty reports before. They had received transmissions from units being overrun. They had listened to men dying over open channels, heard the sounds of combat and screaming, and the wet mechanical noises of bodies being destroyed by weapons designed for exactly that purpose. But this was different. This silence was not the silence of communications failure or enemy jamming. This was the silence of completion, of a task finished, of a voice that had said everything it needed to say, and had nothing left except the empty channel and the carrier wave that would continue until someone had the courage to reach out and terminate the connection, to flip the switch that would transform this open line into dead air, to make official what everyone already knew, that the men on the other end were gone, that the mission was over, that all that remained was paperwork and casualty notifications, and the long bureaucratic process of accounting for the dead. The operator survived. That is the strange and almost offensive miracle of war. The way it kills indiscriminately and spares randomly. The way it takes men who did everything right and leaves alive men who violated every rule. He should have died. By every tactical assessment, every statistical probability, every reasonable expectation, he should have died with the rest of his unit in that forgotten defensive position that would not appear in any history book, that would merit only a footnote in official after-action reports. But a patrol that was not supposed to be in that sector, that had taken a wrong turn, or followed outdated intelligence, or simply made the kind of navigational error that happens when exhausted men read maps by moonlight, stumbled across the position 4 hours after the transmission ended. They found bodies. They found the wreckage of a defensive stand that had gone exactly as everyone at headquarters had known it would go. They found the radio still transmitting that empty carrier wave, the equipment functioning perfectly despite everything, still connected to a headquarters that had listened to silence for hours without having the courage to disconnect. And they found the operator, unconscious from blood loss, his hands still clutching the microphone, his body draped across the radio equipment as if he had been trying to protect it with his own flesh, as if preserving that transmission mattered more than preserving his own life. They evacuated him to a field hospital where surgeons worked with the efficient brutality of men who had learned to see bodies as mechanical problems, to be solved rather than as human beings who deserved gentleness. They stabilized him. They transfused him. They repaired the damage that shrapnel and bullets and 3 days of combat had inflicted on a body that was 22 years old, but would never be young again. And when he woke up, groggy with morphine and trauma, the first thing they told him was that he was being charged with violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Not "you're lucky to be alive," not "you're a hero," not "thank God the patrol found you," just the flat bureaucratic statement that he was being court-martialed for unauthorized use of military communications equipment, for failure to maintain communication discipline, for insubordination, for violations so numerous and severe that they were still compiling the complete list of charges. The absurdity was so profound, it transcended anger or outrage, or any normal human response. He had used a radio to speak the names of dying men. He had violated communication protocol to preserve their last words. He had ignored orders from headquarters because those orders had required him to treat his brothers as tactical assets rather than as human beings who deserved to be remembered. And for this, for bearing witness, for building a monument out of sound, for refusing to let those men disappear into the anonymous machinery of war, he would face formal charges. Possible imprisonment, dishonorable discharge, the permanent stain of military justice branded onto his record for the rest of his life. The charges were detailed and specific. Unauthorized use of military communications equipment during combat operations. Failure to follow direct orders from a superior officer. Broadcasting classified information over unsecured channels. Compromising operational security by revealing unit composition and casualty status, insubordination, conduct unbecoming, dereliction of duty. The list went on, each charge carrying potential penalties that ranged from reduction in rank to years of imprisonment. The military lawyers who interviewed him, young JAG officers who had never been in combat, who knew regulations but not war, who understood law but not the impossible moral calculus of men dying in the darkness, explained that he had violated fundamental principles of military discipline. They explained that radio channels existed to serve tactical purposes, not personal ones. They explained that his transmission, however well-intentioned, had compromised security and possibly endangered other units by revealing information about combat operations. They explained that following orders was the bedrock of military effectiveness, that without discipline, the entire system collapsed, that his decision to ignore direct commands from headquarters represented a fundamental betrayal of the trust that held the military together. They explained all of this in calm, professional voices, sitting in clean offices far from any battlefield, their uniforms pressed and their hands unscarred. Their understanding of war filtered through regulations and manuals and the sanitized language of military justice. The recording existed. That was the strange permanence of his crime, the way sound could be captured and preserved and replayed, the way his violation had been automatically archived by the same systems designed to monitor tactical communications. 47 minutes of audio, digitally preserved, officially classified, stamped with security designations that would keep it sealed for decades. 23 names spoken in a voice that grew progressively more hoarse and desperate. Final messages that ranged from the profound to the mundane, from declarations of love to apologies for borrowed money, from last wishes to fragments of interrupted thoughts. All of it preserved in a medium that would outlast everyone involved, filed away in military archives under classifications that labeled it compromised intelligence, rather than what it actually was, a record of human beings facing death and choosing to be remembered as something more than casualties. The families would never hear it. That was decided immediately by officers who understood that the recording represented not a gift to the grieving, but a liability to the institution, evidence of chaos and breakdown, and the failure of command to maintain control over its personnel, even in extremis. The wives and mothers and children would receive folded flags and casualty notifications, and the standard condolence letters that expressed gratitude for sacrifice and promise that their loved ones had died serving their country with honor. They would not receive the actual last words, the real final thoughts, the unfiltered truth of what their sons and husbands and fathers had been thinking about when death approached. The operator sat through the preliminary hearings in silence. The military lawyers asked him to explain his actions, to justify his decisions, to provide some defense that could be presented to the court-martial board. He offered nothing. No explanations, no justifications, no appeals to emotion or higher principles or the moral authority of dying men's last requests. When asked directly why he had violated communication protocols, why he had ignored direct orders, why he had used military equipment to broadcast unauthorized messages, he gave a single response that would be entered into the official record and would haunt everyone who read it. "They asked me to remember them," he said, his voice flat and empty of everything except statement of fact. "I did, that was all. No elaboration. No attempt to contextualize or justify or defend. Just the simple acknowledgement that men had trusted him with their last words, and he had honored that trust in the only way available to him. That preserving their memory had mattered more than preserving his career, or his freedom, or his adherence to regulations that treated human beings as tactical assets to be managed rather than as souls departing. This world who deserved to be remembered with dignity and specificity and love. They asked me to remember them. I did. 6 words that contained entire philosophies of duty and conscience, and the hierarchy of obligations that govern human behavior when military discipline collides with moral imperative. 6 words that would be quoted and analyzed and debated in the decades to come, long after everyone involved was dead, long after the war itself had faded into history, preserved in that recording that remained classified, archived, hidden away like something too dangerous for public consumption, too real for the sanitized narratives nations prefer to tell about the costs of war and the sacrifices of the young men who pay those costs with their lives and their silence, and their transformation into symbols that bear no resemblance to the complicated, frightened, loving, ordinary human beings they actually were. 27 years passed before anyone heard the recording again. 27 years, during which the magnetic tape sat in a climate-controlled vault deep in the archives of military intelligence, filed under classifications that ensured it would never be accidentally discovered, never be requested by historians, never be subjected to the Freedom of Information Act requests that periodically forced the declassification of other materials from that war. It existed in a bureaucratic limbo, too sensitive to be destroyed, but too problematic to be acknowledged. A piece of evidence that indicted no one and everyone, that served no tactical purpose and yet somehow threatened the entire carefully constructed narrative of how wars are fought and how soldiers die and how the living remember the dead. The tape degraded slowly despite the controlled environment, the magnetic particles gradually losing their alignment, the audio slowly bleeding into noise, time itself working to erase what the military had tried to preserve and conceal simultaneously. And then, in the early 2000s, a military historian named Sarah Chen, no relation to the operator, though the coincidence of names would seem almost too neat if this were fiction, was assigned the unglamorous task of digitizing old recordings before they degraded beyond recovery. She was working through boxes of material that had been scheduled for destruction, routine communications and tactical briefings, and the mundane audio detritus of a war that had ended before she was born. She was expecting nothing. She was transferring files to digital format as a preservation formality, creating backups of materials that probably no one would ever listen to, performing the archival equivalent of data entry. And then she loaded a tape labeled, only with a date and a designation number, and heard a voice that had been dead for nearly 3 decades begin to speak names. Into the silence of her small office, she listened to the entire 47 minutes without moving, her hand frozen on the playback controls, tears streaming down her face without her awareness or consent. She had heard combat recordings before. Her work involved processing audio from multiple conflicts, listening to the voices of men under fire, the sound of battles being fought in real time. But this was different. This was not the chaos of combat captured accidentally by equipment that happened to be recording. This was intentional, deliberate, a constructed memorial built word by someone who knew he was creating a record that would outlast the moment. She heard the operator's voice grow hoarse as he spoke each name, heard the way he paused between transmissions as if gathering strength or waiting for another dying man to whisper final words that needed to be preserved. She heard headquarters interrupting with increasingly angry demands for communication discipline, heard the operator ignore them with a calm that suggested he had moved beyond fear of consequences, beyond concern for anything except the task he had appointed himself to complete. She heard the names, the hometowns, the ages that were all impossibly young, the final messages that ranged from profound declarations to mundane requests, from deathbed wisdom to simple ordinary thoughts about pot roast and fishing ponds and unfinished construction projects. And she heard the silence at the end, the 3 hours and 42 minutes of empty carrier wave that the archive had preserved, along with the transmission itself. As if even the absence of voice deserved to be remembered, the ethical dilemma announced itself immediately, even before the emotional impact had fully registered, even before she had processed what she had just heard. These families had never been told this recording existed. They had received folded flags and condolence letters, and whatever personal effects could be recovered from the battlefield. They had grieved for sons and husbands and fathers who had died in a war that had not made sense to many of them, whose strategic objectives and tactical necessities had seemed increasingly hollow as the body bags came home and the protests grew louder and the nation turned against the conflict that consumed their children. They had built whatever peace they could with incomplete information, with imagination filling the gaps where knowledge should have been, with the small comfort of not knowing exactly how their loved ones had died, or what they had suffered, or what their final thoughts had been. Some had spent decades in that state of suspended grief, unable to fully mourn because the details remained classified, unable to fully heal because questions remained unanswered, carrying the weight of not knowing like a stone in their chest that grew heavier with each passing year. And now, in a climate-controlled archive, there existed a recording that could answer some of those questions, that contained actual last words spoken in actual final moments, that offered a specificity and intimacy that no official casualty report could provide. Did they have a right to hear it? Did she have a right to withhold it? Who owned these words? The military that had recorded them, the operator who had transmitted them, or the families who had loved the men who spoke them? Sarah Chen spent weeks researching, trying to track down the families of the 23 men whose names appeared in the transmission. Some were impossible to locate, their trails having gone cold decades ago, families that had moved or changed names or simply disappeared into the vast anonymity of American life. Others she found through patient detective work, cross-referencing obituaries and property records and genealogical databases, following threads of connection until she could identify children and siblings and widows who were now elderly themselves, their lives having continued in the absence of the men who had died young. She contacted them carefully, explaining nothing initially except that she was a military historian who had discovered a recording that mentioned their loved one, asking if they would be interested in learning more. The responses varied so dramatically that they seemed to come from different species of grief, rather than simply different individuals processing the same type of loss. Some responded immediately with desperate eagerness. "Yes, please, anything, any information at all. I've been waiting 50 years to know something real about how he died. To hear anything beyond the sanitized language of casualty notifications." Others responded with confusion, suspicion, the wariness of people who had been let down by military bureaucracy before, who did not trust that this stranger offering information had their best interests at heart. And some responded with fear that manifested as anger, their messages making clear that the wound had finally scarred over and they had no interest in having it reopened, that they had made peace with not knowing and preferred to keep that peace rather than invite new trauma into lives that had taken decades to rebuild. She arranged interviews, traveling to meet the families who wanted to know more, who had questions that might be answered by what existed on that tape. She met Rodriguez's mother in a small apartment in the Bronx, now in her 80s, still keeping her son's room exactly as he had left it. His high school graduation photo on the dresser alongside the folded flag from his funeral. The old woman cried when Sarah explained what she had found, cried and touched the rosary around her own neck. The sister to the one she had given her son, and said she had prayed every day for decades, that he had kept his faith, that he had died with God in his heart, that the rosary had protected his soul even if it could not protect his body. "Can I hear him?" she asked, her voice breaking on the question. "Can I hear my boy's voice one more time?" Sarah explained gently that the recording did not contain Rodriguez's actual voice, only the operator speaking on his behalf, relaying his final words. But yes, she could hear what he wanted his family to know, what he was thinking about in those final moments. The old woman nodded and wept and said yes, please. She wanted to hear it. She needed to hear it. She had been waiting 50 years to know if her son had remembered her, if he had died afraid or at peace, if he had kept the faith she had tried to instill in him since childhood. She met Jenkins' sister in Alabama, now a grandmother herself, who sat on her porch and listened to Sarah explain about the recording and said nothing for a long time, just looked out at the pond behind the house where her brother used to fish. The pond that was still there all these decades later, still and dark and full of the shadows he used to describe in letters home. "My mama never got over it," she finally said. "She died 10 years after Bobby did, and I think she died of grief more than anything medical. She used to talk about him every day, wonder what his last thoughts were, if he was scared, if he was in pain, if he thought about us." The sister looked at Sarah with eyes that had seen too much loss. Would it have helped her to know, or would it have made it worse? Sarah had no answer to that, could offer only the honest admission that she did not know. That grief was individual and unpredictable, that information could heal or harm, depending on factors that had nothing to do with the information itself. The sister thought about it for a long time, and then said she wanted to hear what Bobby had said. Not for herself, she had made her peace with his death a long time ago, but because their mother had died not knowing. And maybe somehow this knowledge could reach backward through time and ease a suffering that had ended a decade ago, but had never really been resolved. She met Miller's younger sister in Oregon, the one who had graduated from college while her brother was dying in a war he never fully understood. The one who had gotten married without him there to walk her down the aisle, who had named her first son after him and tried to explain to that child who his uncle had been, even though she herself had been grappling with the same question. The sister was now in her 60s, a retired teacher who had spent her career trying to instill in young people the critical thinking skills that might prevent future generations from marching off to wars that made no moral or strategic sense. She listened to Sarah's explanation of the recording with the careful attention of someone trained to identify gaps and inconsistencies in narratives. "He apologized to me?" she asked, and Sarah nodded, explained that yes, The operator had transmitted an apology for missing her wedding, an expression of pride in her accomplishments, a hope that she understood why he had enlisted, even if he himself had come to question that decision. The sister laughed, a sound with no humor in it. I never blamed him. I was angry at the war, at the politicians, at the military, at everyone who sent him there, but never at him. She paused, seemed to be wrestling with something. Does the recording make the war make more sense? Does it explain why he had to die? And Sarah had to admit that no, it did not explain anything, did not provide strategic justification or moral clarity, offered only the reality of what her brother had been thinking about in his final moments, which had nothing to do with geopolitics or domino theories or any of the abstractions that had been used to justify sending him to that place. Washington's daughter was the hardest interview. Grace Washington was now 28 years old, the same age her father would have been when she was born, living a life that ran parallel to the one he never got to live. She had no memory of him, had grown up with only photographs and stories told by a mother who had remarried years ago, who had built a new life with a good man who had raised Grace as his own daughter, but who could never erase the ghost of the first father, the one who existed only in images and second-hand recollections. Grace had complicated feelings about the father she never knew, a mixture of longing and resentment, grief for a relationship that never existed, and anger at a choice, enlisting, going to war, that had deprived her of something she could never recover. She met Sarah in a coffee shop and listened to the explanation of the recording with an expression that was hard to read, protective and vulnerable simultaneously. "He carried my picture?" she asked. "He looked at it when things were bad?" Sarah nodded, explained that yes, according to the operator, her father had kept that photograph over his heart, had looked at it constantly, had died with it clutched in his hand, had wanted her to know that thinking about her face had given him strength and peace, even in the worst moments. Grace was quiet for a long time, staring at her coffee like it contained answers to questions she did not know how to ask. "I used to be angry at him," she finally admitted, "for leaving before I was born, for choosing the military over being there for my mother's pregnancy, for dying and leaving us alone. I know that's not fair, that he didn't choose to die. But grief isn't fair, and growing up without a father isn't fair, and I was just a kid who wanted a dad and couldn't understand why everyone else had one, and I didn't." She looked up at Sarah, her eyes wet. "If I hear the recording, will it change that? Will it make up for all the birthdays he missed, and the graduations he wasn't at, and the advice I needed that he never got to give?" Sarah had to tell her the truth, which was that the recording would not repair the past or restore what was lost, would not give back the father-daughter relationship that should have existed, would not erase the decades of absence and complicated grief. It would only provide information, specific and intimate information, about what Grace's father had been thinking in his final moments. Confirmation that she had been loved, that she had mattered to him, that in the worst circumstances imaginable, he had found comfort in thinking about her. Whether that information would help or hurt was something Grace would have to decide for herself, something Sarah could not predict or guarantee. Some of the families, after hearing this honest assessment, chose not to listen to the recording. They had made their peace with not knowing, had constructed narratives that worked for them, had found ways to remember their loved ones that did not require the specificity and potential trauma of hearing last words mediated through a stranger's voice. Others insisted they wanted to hear it, needed to hear it, felt that anything was better than the uncertainty they had carried for decades. And a few, like Grace Washington, remained caught in indecision, torn between the desire to know and the fear that knowing would somehow make things worse, that the fantasy father she had constructed in imagination might be destroyed by the reality of who he actually was in those final moments. The operator himself was the last person Sarah tracked down, though he was the first one she had tried to find. Michael Chen had left the military immediately after his court-martial was expunged. That was another part of the story she had uncovered through careful research. The way charges that should have destroyed his life had been quietly dropped, files sealed, the entire incident buried as if it had never happened. He had returned to civilian life and disappeared so completely that it took months of detective work to locate him. She found him living in a small town in the Pacific Northwest, working as a radio technician for a local broadcast station. A job that let him work with the equipment he understood, without requiring him to speak much to other people. He had never married. He had no children. He lived alone in a small house that was meticulously maintained, but devoid of personal touches, photographs, anything that suggested a life connected to other lives. When Sarah called and explained who she was and what she wanted to talk about, there was a long silence on the phone. So long she thought the connection had been lost. Then he said, in a voice that sounded like it had not been used for anything important in years, that she could come see him, that he would talk to her, though he could not promise it would be useful because he had not spoken about that day to anyone since it happened. She drove to his house on a grey afternoon that threatened rain, the kind of weather that seemed appropriate for conversations about death and memory and choices made decades ago that still resonated in the present. He answered the door looking older than his years, a man in his early 50s who moved like someone much more elderly, carrying invisible weight that manifested in his posture and his careful movements. They sat in his living room, which contained a couch and a television and nothing else. No books or decorations or signs of hobbies or interests. A space that felt temporary even though he had lived there for years. Sarah explained about the recording, about her work digitizing the archives, about how she had found the tape and listened to it, and been trying ever since to understand what it meant and what should be done with it. He listened without interrupting, his face showing no expression, his hands folded in his lap like he was waiting for a verdict. When she finished explaining, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said something that she would remember for the rest of her life, that would shape every decision she made about the recording and its distribution. "I broke the rules because the rules had broken," he said, his voice steady and empty of inflection, stating a fact rather than defending a choice. Someone had to remember them as men, not coordinates on a map. He looked at her directly for the first time since she had arrived. "The military wanted me to maintain communication discipline while my brothers died, asking me to tell their families they were loved. The manual said I should report tactical information, but there was no tactical information that mattered anymore. We were already dead. Command had written us off. The only thing that mattered was making sure those men didn't disappear completely, that their last thoughts were preserved somewhere, that somebody bore witness to who they were in those final moments." He paused, seemed to be deciding whether to continue. "I carry them with me every day, every single one of them. I can still hear their voices, not the recording, but the actual voices, the way they sounded when they whispered their last words to me. Jenkins talking about fishing, Rodriguez praying in Spanish, Miller apologizing to his sister, Washington talking about his daughter." His voice cracked slightly on the last name, the first sign of emotion Sarah had seen from him. "Grace. Her name was Grace." He said it over and over. Grace, Grace, like it was a prayer. Like saying her name could somehow reach across the distance and touch her. Like love could travel through syllables and static and time. Chen looked at Sarah with eyes that had seen something that changed their fundamental nature, that had witnessed things that could not be forgotten or processed or integrated into a normal civilian life. "The families should hear it if they want to," he said. "That's what I was trying to do. Give them their last words back. Preserve them for the people who had the right to hear them. The military classified it because it was embarrassing, because it showed their system had failed, because it revealed that soldiers are human beings with families and fears and ordinary thoughts about ordinary things, not just tactical assets to be managed and casualties to be counted. But those words don't belong to the military. They never did. They belong to the mothers and wives and children who loved those men and who have every right to know what they were thinking about when they died. He stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the grey afternoon. I've carried those words for 27 years. I've held them inside me because no one else would. But I'm tired. I'm so tired. And if there's a chance that those families can hear what I heard, can know what their sons and husbands and fathers wanted them to know, then that recording should be given to them. Not because it will heal anything. You can't heal death. You can't fix grief, but because it's the truth. And people have a right to the truth about their own dead, even if the truth is hard, even if it hurts, even if it doesn't make the war make sense or the loss any easier to bear. The recording remains classified. That is the bureaucratic reality that persists despite everything. Despite the ethical arguments and the family's requests and the operator's explicit statement that the words belong to the loved ones who have waited decades to hear them. The military reviewed Sarah Chen's request to declassify the material and denied it on grounds that are themselves classified, citing national security concerns that make no sense for a recording from a war that ended generations ago. The families who wanted to hear their loved ones' last words were told that the material could not be released, that protocols existed for good reasons, that exceptions could not be made. Some accepted this decision with weary resignation. Others fought it, hired lawyers, filed Freedom of Information Act requests that were denied, wrote letters to congressmen who expressed sympathy but could do nothing. The recording remained locked away, accessible only to archivists with proper clearances. A monument that no one except a handful of historians would ever visit. Last words that would never reach the ears they were intended for. The court-martial was quietly expunged from Michael Chen's record in a process that was as mysterious as the classification itself. Someone, somewhere in the chain of command, made a decision that the charges should disappear, that the violation of communication protocols should be erased from official history as if it had never happened. Chen simply received a letter years after the fact informing him that his discharge status had been upgraded, that the violations had been removed from his permanent record, that for all official purposes he was considered to have served honorably and without incident. He never knew who made that decision or why. The expungement meant that legally, officially, his transmission had never happened. But the recording still existed, still sat in its climate-controlled vault, still preserved those 47 minutes of names and hometowns and final messages. Proof that something had happened, even if the official record denied it. Chen died in 2003, a quiet death from a heart attack, alone in his small house in the Pacific Northwest. The obituary in the local newspaper was brief, mentioning his work at the radio station and his service in the military, but providing no details, no hint that he had been involved in anything unusual or noteworthy. The service was small, attended mostly by colleagues who knew him as a competent but distant man who kept to himself and never talked about his past. No military honor guard, no flag draped over the coffin, no recognition of what he had done or why it mattered. He had asked for none of that, had specified in his will that his service should not be mentioned beyond the basic facts. He wanted to disappear as quietly as possible, to slip away from a world that had never quite made sense to him after that day when he had watched his brothers die and made the choice that would define the rest of his life. Sarah Chen attended the funeral, standing in the back, the only person there who understood what was being buried, that this quiet technician had been, for 47 minutes decades ago, the voice that refused to let dying men be forgotten. Stephen Ambrose spent his career trying to capture what made American soldiers capable of extraordinary courage in service, of ideals that transcended self-interest. At the core, the American citizen soldiers knew the difference between right and wrong, and they didn't want to live in a world in which wrong prevailed. Chen's transmission was an act of moral clarity in moral chaos. He knew that following orders meant betraying the trust of dying men, He knew that maintaining communication discipline meant erasing the humanity of soldiers who deserved to be remembered as individuals rather than statistics. He knew the difference between right and wrong, between the protocol that served bureaucratic efficiency and the duty that served human dignity. And in that impossible situation, surrounded by death and abandoned by the command structure that was supposed to protect him, he chose to preserve souls over preserving his career, to honor the dead over honoring the manual. The paradox of memory is that we claim to honor the fallen while simultaneously sanitizing their deaths, reducing them to symbols that fit comfortably into national narratives. We build memorials to the fallen, monuments of marble and bronze that transform young men who died screaming for their mothers into heroic figures frozen in poses of noble sacrifice. We hold ceremonies and give speeches and lay wreaths, performing rituals of remembrance that are more about comforting the living than about honestly confronting what the dead actually experienced. The whole truth includes the fear and the pain and the ordinary thoughts about pot roast and fishing ponds, includes the crying and the final moments when all pretense fell away, and they were simply terrified young men who wanted to go home. That 47-minute recording contains too much reality for public consumption, too much unfiltered humanity for the clean narratives we prefer. The recording is classified not because it contains tactical secrets, but because it threatens the mythology we need to believe in order to keep sending young men to war. William Manchester wrote about returning to the Pacific Islands where he had fought, trying to understand why he had violated orders to return to the front when he was injured and should have been evacuated. I understand at last why I jumped hospital that long ago Sunday and, in violation of orders, returned to the front. I had to be with my people. The operator stayed on the radio for the same primal reason. He could have maintained protocol, could have followed orders, and protected himself from the consequences of insubordination. But his people were dying, and they had asked him to remember them, and abandoning that obligation would have meant abandoning everything that made him human. The operator's transmission was an act of profound loyalty to his people, a refusal to let them disappear into the machinery of war, a violation of military discipline in service of a deeper discipline that has no manual and no regulations, but that every soldier recognizes when they feel it. The question we inherit from this story is this: if those men's final words are classified, are we honoring them or hiding from the true cost of what we ask them to do? When we sanitize their deaths and reduce them to symbols and file away the actual recordings of their last moments under security classifications that will outlast everyone who loved them, whose interests are we serving? Not the interests of the families who have waited decades to know what their sons and husbands and fathers were thinking when they died. Not the interests of the dead who trusted someone to preserve their words and deliver their messages to the people they loved. We are serving the interests of institutions that prefer mythology to reality, that need war to be something other than what it actually is. The recording threatens that mythology by revealing the human cost in too much detail, by giving us names and hometowns and specific mundane thoughts that make it impossible to think about these casualties as abstract numbers in a strategic calculation. The last transmission continues. Whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we listen or choose to look away, every time we say a veteran's name, we are continuing that broadcast. Every time we share their story, insist on specificity instead of abstraction. Refuse to let their sacrifice become a statistic or a symbol. We are doing what the operator did, bearing witness, preserving memory, honoring the human being behind the uniform. The transmission that began decades ago in a desperate defensive position has never really ended. It echoes through time every time someone chooses to remember the dead as they actually were, rather than as we wish they had been. The broadcast continues and says, "You were here. You mattered. You were more than a mission. You were more than acceptable losses. You were human beings with names and families and ordinary thoughts and extraordinary courage. And your last words deserved to be heard. The moral of this story is that some violations of protocol are acts of higher obedience. The operator did not preserve tactical information that might have changed the course of the war. He preserved something the manual had no category for. He preserved souls. He captured the last thoughts of dying men and broadcast them into a future that did not want to hear them. And in doing so, he fulfilled an obligation that transcended every regulation. He violated communication protocol in service of a higher protocol, one that says human beings deserve to be remembered, that last words matter, that the dead have a right to be mourned as individuals rather than as casualties. 23 men died asking to be remembered. One man violated every rule to make sure they were. And we have spent decades trying to forget both the transmission and the choice that made it possible. Uncomfortable with the questions it raises about how we honor sacrifice and whether we truly want to know what we ask young men to endure when we send them to war in our name.